Even in Cologne, they think it's joyful to stand alone and in the rain. And I'm spoiling to meet you, Abel Lincoln Esquire. You blacker, it's only I'm weary of the rain. And I'm praying, and I'm praying, and it's rain is but a while.
I'd like to welcome everybody to the Central New York Living History Center. A special thanks to the Daughters of Union Veterans for making the trip from Broome County. I'd like to introduce Major Wayne Waite. Major Waite is the upstate New York, I would guess, expert on Civil War medicine. We ran into Major Waite in Albany at a timeline, at a historical timeline they were doing in Albany, and we were overwhelmed, I guess, at the amount of hands-on, if you will, or hands-off, depending on how you look at it, stuff that Major Waite had, and it's incredible. His knowledge is fantastic, and his presentation is memorable. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Major Waite and Civil War medicine.
Thank you very much. Thank you. First off, I represent the 117th New York Volunteers that mustered out of Rome, New York in 1862. It was just a regiment that I picked because it's near me, so I had a lot of information on them. They fought, one of the biggest battles they fought was at Fort Fisher, North Carolina. That was the last bastion that the Confederates had for supplies coming in and out of Wilmington, and Lincoln wanted it stopped. They tried bombarding the place in December of 1864, and it really didn't do any good. It was a sand fort, big, huge mounds of sand. They realized it didn't work, so they were going to try again in January. So on January 15th, 1865, they decided they were going to put land troops on up near Wilmington and come down. It was a little bit of an island, come down the coast and attack. And the 117th was one of the first units. They fought with the 3rd New York, and they took the big gun. So they actually captured the fort. So very, very proud of them. As far as Civil War medicine, I'm going to ask a few questions and see if you people have any knowledge. Do you know how many Union soldiers died from just gunshot wounds during the war? Any idea? How about 110,000? That's just gunshot wounds. That's not operations. What about Confederates? How many died in battle from various wounds?
80,000?
95,000. I'd like to go over the statistics because it really hits home and it makes people realize how devastating this war was. 250,000 died from infection and disease in the Union Army. 186,000 died from disease in the Confederate Army. Over 30,000 amputations in the Union Army with a 27% fatality rate. 1,739,135 Union soldiers were hospitalized with diarrhea and dysentery. 44,558 Union deaths because of this. That was the number 2 killer during the war. Infection and disease was the number 1. It was also called the Virginia Quick Step or the Tennessee Trots. That was their famous names for those. Hospital gangrene. Usually showed up in the major hospitals, which would have been in Washington, New York City, Philadelphia, simply because they would have been secondary amputations. 46% of all hospital gangrene patients died. Primary amputations, which would have happened out in the field, at a field hospital, for gangrene, were mostly done in the field hospitals. So they would have come off the field, amputation, gangrene showed up, they did their amputation, then they sent them off, they healed up enough to go to a general hospital, and gangrene showed up. Usually within 12 to 48 hours, gangrene's going to show up. So in that travel time, they wound up having to have a secondary amputation. Remember, transfusions were not done during the Civil War. Union surgeons. In 1861, there was about 110 in the Union Army. Approximately 29 left to go to the Confederacy. By the end of the war, there were 12,000 physicians in the Union Army. And a lot of these came out of colleges, medical colleges, because there were so many wounded out on the field, they had to have all these men out there working on all these surgeons available. Union surgeons, 19 died in battle, 10 were wounded, 4 died in prison, 281 died from disease. Now, I understand dying from disease because they were around it all the time. Very unsanitary conditions. I'm going to talk about some of the medications that they used, especially in the Union Army. Calomel. There was another name for calomel. Does anybody know what that would have been? You ever hear of blue mass? It's a famous pill or medication that was given for diarrhea and dysentery at the time. But the mixture is what really killed them. The mixture had mercury, licorice, rose water, powdered rose, honey, and sugar. And it came in pills, pill form. They look like this. The mercury is what gave it the blue color. President Lincoln actually took some of these. That's been documented. He just didn't take enough to kill him. Surgeon General Hammond, after a while, went to the Union Army and said, "We've got to stop dispensing this. It's killing people." The Army put it off for quite a while, a couple more months. And finally they gave in. They said, "Okay, we'll take it off the market." It worked. It stopped the diarrhea and dysentery, but it killed the men. Alcohol. Alcohol. Whiskey, brandy, sherry, wine, and cordials was very prevalent in the Union Army during the war. Simply because you had a lot of drunks, for one thing. Sick call in the morning, that was the first thing they wanted. And that was up to the surgeon to dispense that. It wasn't up to anybody else. If he felt he needed some whiskey, it was up to the surgeon. If he wasn't going to give it to him, again, it's up to the surgeon. The real purpose for it was debility, shock, and fever. Laudanum. I'm sure everybody's heard about laudanum. That was 10% opium and 90% whiskey. Very, very good painkiller. Everybody knows about that. It was also a sedative, and it was used for diarrhea. It was easily made because you could take it internally, or you could use it topically right on a wound to help kill some of the pain. And being a product of whiskey and opium, if you had the opium, you had the whiskey, you could mix up very quickly, and it was very handy. Morphine. Morphine was used during the war, another painkiller. It was a pill, powder or mixed with water, and sometimes injected by syringe. Now they did have syringes. Some of them looked like this, some of them were larger, different types of syringes, but this is what they used for injections. Bromine. Bromine was an antiseptic at the time. It started out slowly at the beginning of the war, but towards the end of the war, more surgeons were using it because it was cleansing the wounds better. It was cleaning. It's a caustic powder that you would put on the wound and it would foam, type thing. It was basically, they had iodine, which was another antiseptic, but it didn't work as well as a bromine. Bromine worked a lot better. I'm going to talk about, I mentioned earlier, Jonathan Letterman. A lot of people don't know about him. A very important person in the medical field during the Civil War and today. Because if it weren't for him, we wouldn't have a lot of the technology we have today. As lethal as modern warfare has become, it's comforting to know that today's soldiers stand a better chance than ever before surviving combat injuries. In Afghanistan, battlefield first aid, rapid evacuations, and quickly reachable military field hospitals have saved thousands of men and women who might otherwise have died. What's remarkable about these casualty management procedures is that they haven't changed that much from the 1860s, when they were introduced into the Union Army. At the Battle of Second Manassas in late August 1862, more than 22,000 soldiers were killed or wounded. Nearly 14,000 of them were Federal troops. Soldiers were strewn about, crying for water and medical attention. A full week would pass before all of the Union injured were removed from the battlefield. Imagine that, laying out wounded out on a field for a week. This was the total inefficiency in dealing with the wounded. On September 17, 1862, the Battle of Antietam occurred at Sharpsburg, Maryland, and in just 12 hours, almost 23,000 soldiers, Union and Confederate, had fallen. This might have been another second Manassas for the medical director, but fortunately, Dr. Jonathan Letterman had been in charge for 3 months previous to the battle. Jonathan Letterman was born on December 11, 1824 in Canonsburg, Pennsylvania, southwest of Pittsburgh. His father, William Henry Letterman, was a physician, and a young Jonathan grew up wanting to emulate his father. As such, in 1842, he enrolled in Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia and graduated in March 1849. He was appointed an assistant surgeon in June of the same year. He served in Minnesota, Florida, and New Mexico. By 1861, he accompanied troops from California to New York City and was assigned to the Army of the Potomac. On June 23, 1862, he replaced Charles S. Tripler as medical director of the Army of the Potomac. On July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of 1863, one of the largest battles of the Civil War occurred in Gettysburg. By the end of the battle, there were over 50,000 dead, wounded, and missing soldiers. Nearly 21,000 needed to be medically treated. Because of the amount of wounded, a very large general hospital had to be set up. It was named Camp Letterman. It was erected on the George Wolfe Farm off of the York Road, close proximity to the railroad. It covered 80 acres and consisted of 500 tents, a kitchen, supplies, a cemetery, and a morgue. Dr. Henry Janes was in charge of the camp until it closed in November of that year. Today, this area is only commemorated by a plaque next to Route 30 across from McDonald's. Very sad. Surgeon John McNulty sent this report to Dr. Letterman. It is with extreme satisfaction that I can assure you that the ambulance and field hospital system now in place enable me to remove the wounded from the field, shelter, feed them, and dress their wounds within 6 hours after the battle, and to have every capital operation performed within 24 hours after the injury was received. What a great improvement. Amazing. Just for making a few changes. Some of his great accomplishments were he helped create core hospitals with better surgeons and assembly type of preparation, surgery, and bandaging. So what he did is he went around and he took volunteer surgeons from volunteer regiments, the best surgeons out of those, and created a core hospital. So now you've got maybe 6 or 7 surgeons in one spot. Assistant surgeons the same way, the best assistant surgeons, and stewards. And you're going to have an assembly line. So over here you have a prep area, so anesthesia, some more medications maybe, surgery here, then over here, your bandaging, suturing, and so forth would be taken care of, medications, and into the hospital tent. You imagine how fast these men were going through this hospital, faster than ever. What this means is these men are being saved. More men are being saved. It made a big improvement. He reorganized the ambulance system so more ambulances were available. Officers were responsible for the driver's actions. At the beginning of the war in 1861, all they did was hire drivers. People just wanted to make some money, so they hired them. They didn't care where they were going, what kind of roads they were on. Some of these men were in the back of the wagon with wounds, and they were dying because the wounds were opening up, because they were driving so fast. So he created a system where you're going to put medical people in charge now, medical drivers and officers in charge. Now, if they're not going where they're supposed to go, I'm going to ask him, how come he didn't go to that hospital like he was told to go? Responsibility. Now they're coming off the field even quicker. You're going to go from this hospital out to that field station, you're going to pick up men, you're going to come back, and that's all you're going to do. Speed. What happens today with an ambulance? The same thing. They pick you up as quickly as possible and they get you to the hospital as quickly as possible. It's the same thing. He developed a triage system, which would have been a field aid station out near the battlefield, where the men would have come in off the field, assistant surgeons and stewards would have been looking at the men, determining the types of wounds and where they're going to go. Major wounds are going to come back to the field hospitals for surgery. They did do some surgery out on the field, but not that much. Minor wounds, you're going to be fixed up and you're going to go back to fight, because that's what you're here for. Major wounds in this type of area, there's not much I can do for them. I did not have the proper training in college to do those types of repairs. So he's going to be told, we're going to get to you as soon as we can. But in other words, you're going to die. In the time that it would take me to try and fix him up in this area, I could save 10 men by doing operations, by amputation. It just made sense at the time, unfortunately. The quartermaster would no longer disperse medical supplies. Now supplies would arrive consistently and in a timely manner. Back then, the quartermaster was in charge of all supplies. In charge of the artillery supplies, cavalry supplies, infantry supplies. Medical was last. This had to stop because men weren't getting the supplies they needed to save their lives. Letterman stepped in, he says, we're going to change that, we're going to put a medical person in charge of the medical supplies. Gee, what a thought. Take the quartermaster right out of the equation. Now, the Union Army is starting to save lives because they have the medications that they need to do that with. Dr. Letterman resigned his post in December of 1864. He wrote a book on his memoirs called Medical Recollections of the Army of the Potomac. On March 15th, 1872, he passed away as a result of a chronic intestinal problem. He died with his work largely unrewarded and unrecognized, and he's buried in Arlington National Cemetery. Of all the men who labored for the sick and wounded during this great war, the name of Jonathan Letterman stands out preeminent. The quotes that I wrote down here were from the Medical Department of the United States of the Army and the Civil War and Medical Recollections of the Army of the Potomac. Just some information. A lot of people don't know about Jonathan Letterman, but he's a really important person. Surgery during the war. 10 to 15 minutes on the average for an amputation. That quick. Simply because we had a lot of other men out here that were wounded and we needed to get them in and get them through the line as quickly as possible. Typical wounds would be cause for an amputation would be skin damage, muscle damage, and bone damage. And some of these were pretty obvious when you bring them in and somebody's leg is blown off. It's basically a cleanup procedure. As long as you had enough skin to cover over the end of the wound, then you could work with that. Over here, what we have is a medical pannier. In 1861, at the beginning of the war, your surgeons had to have a steward with them in the volunteer army. He was required to have some sort of pharmaceutical training because they had to make up the pills and the medications. So I would call the steward over, I would give him medication, he would take a mortar and pestle, and he would make up a medical concoction, what they called it. This is an original pill maker. This is what he would use. He would apply it in this area, take this side, and roll it back and forth until it looked like the size of a pencil, and get it so it's laying right up against this edge. Then you're going to flip this over, put it against this edge, and you're going to slide it. It cuts it about halfway, and then it rolls it the rest of the way, and then it'll come out in this little tray. I made these with flour and water on this pill maker, and they're pretty consistent. There's some smaller ones, but you could scale them and determine the size of the pills and whatnot. But it still works. So, but the reason they had to have the pannier is because these medications were not consistent. This doctor was using this medication, somebody else was using something else, wasn't working. So they went to Eli Squibb, which is still around today, and they wanted the consistent with 52 medicines in it, all number 1 through 52. It weighed 87 pounds, so it was kept in the medicine wagon. And because it bounced around so much, they had to put them in tins. They didn't want glass bottles breaking. What was nice was each medication had a number and the name of the medication on the bottom. So if I know I'm running low on this type of medication and I want some more, I'm going to send a courier down the road to this other federal surgeon, and I'm going to ask him for liquor morphaso fetus. Am I going to ask for that? What am I going to ask for? Number 39. He'll forget about halfway down. What the heck was I supposed to get? Now he's coming back. Number 39 was easy to remember. Now they come back with the morphine. I've got my painkiller back again, and I can go ahead with my surgeries and my medications. It's made a big difference during the war. All the tins were kept in the bottom. The top part had a removable tray, and you could keep extra surgical equipment, bandages, and so forth in the top. This is not an original, this is a replica that I built myself, but you get the general idea of how it worked. Not all medications worked, I can tell you that. How about condensed milk for diarrhea? I don't think that worked out too good. How about white sugar? What do you think white sugar was used for?
Help the medicine go down.
Pardon?
Placebo.
No. No. What sugar do the kids nowadays?
Hiccups.
Well, yeah, probably. Makes them hyper, right? It's a stimulant. It would be a stimulant. So you'd have a man coming in malaise. He didn't want to do anything. I don't want to fight today, doc. I'm really tired and I want to do this. Give him some sugar. Boom. Now he's out there fighting again. Very quick. Same sugar we have today. A lot of opium products down here. Pillay of Opie, which is opium pills. Again, great painkiller. These are some of the instruments that would have been used during the war for amputations. This is a scalpel. This is a retractor. Looks like a dinner fork, doesn't it? It's because it is. My steward lost my good retractor on me one day, and I said, well, I'll get even with him. So last week he decided he had to go into town for something. Took his dinner fork, I broke the middle tine off, and I bent the end of it, and it works as a great retractor. This actually happened. It's been documented in a book. So this is why I talk about it. Then you have amputation saw. This is an original. Notice the wooden handle. You think that can be sterilized? No. We didn't know much about sterilization anyway, so it wouldn't make any difference. This is called a tenaculum. When you cut through an artery, they tend to retract into the muscle. So in order to ligate or tie it off, you need to hook into it and pull it out. And you would have had a suture already loosely applied. You can slide it over and then tie it off. And we would have had several of these already made up. This is a bone nipper. When you cut through a bone, it has a tendency to splinter and jagged edges, so you want to take and clip that stuff off. And of course you have a suturing needle. Down here he has a bullet wound. Now, Confederates at the beginning of the war were using round balls or smoothbore rifles because they came off the farms and they came hunters and that type of thing. That's the kind of guns they were using. Not much punch unless you got really close. I mean, I'm talking within 60 yards. You might be effective, but after that, you're not going to hit much. If you do, it's not going to cause much damage. Now, this gentleman came in and he's got a bullet wound. Now, I need to find a bullet. What am I going to do? How am I going to search for that bullet?
Your fingers
Exactly. Why am I going to use my fingers?
gives you better perception.
I have an instrument that I can use for that, but it's like about this long. Because this part of his leg isn't very thick. And it's quicker to use my finger. And I can feel temperature in there with my finger. And the other reason is I put my finger in there and what's that telling me? Gangrene is set in. Now, I'm not going to bother taking that bullet out. I'm going to do an amputation. That's what's going to save his life. These are some of the decisions these surgeons had to make very quickly. Now, I reach in there, and if it's very, very cold, wow. And he's not bleeding very much. His leg's kind of pale, and it's cold. What's that telling me?
Frostbite.
No.
No blood circulation.
He's bled out. His leg is bled out. I have no idea when these men were shot. I can guess, but I don't know actually. He could have been out on the field for 2 days, and then he comes into the hospital. So now I have to work with that. So if that's the case, now I'm going to go into an amputation, and then I have to figure out how far up his leg do I have to remove. Especially with gangrene, because it travels through the blood. So when I do an amputation, I'm guessing. So he may have to have another amputation like we were talking about earlier. He's okay here at this hospital. Once he's good enough to travel, then we send him to the major hospitals. And then gangrene may set in again because I didn't capture it here. Now that's called a secondary operation, secondary amputation. On the other hand, if I reach in there and he's still bleeding pretty good chance he's just been wounded. I can feel the bullet. I can also feel the bone. There's no damage to the bone because it's a round ball. Round ball didn't have much punch. Most of them, if they were going slow enough, just bounced off the bone. They didn't do a lot of damage. Now that I've located the bullet and it's bleeding, I can probably save his leg. So I'm going to reach in, get a hold of the bullet. I'm going to pull it out. We'll leave it down there. Now, with that bleeding, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some laudanum. Again, this says opium in it. And I'm going to pour it directly in that wound to help kill some of the pain. Once I've done that, then I'm going to pack it. Then we're going to bandage it. And in about a day, we're going to check it to see how he's doing. I may wind up suturing this afterwards. I don't know. All depends how well he's getting along. But the steward's going to be the one that keeps an eye on him. And it's really going to be up to him to let me know if he has any issues. And he may wind up going home to a general hospital and then home after that. They talk about 620,000 men died during the war. That's being changed because there was men that went home afterwards and then died because of their wounds. Maybe 3 months after they got home or whatever. That really didn't get counted in the statistics. They're talking about over 700,000 because of these men that didn't get counted. So. This is a 69 caliber bullet. I want you to pass that around, and I want you to feel the weight of it. That's almost an ounce of lead. That's the largest bullet that they used during the war. that bullet would go in like this. Remember, this man would have pants on, probably dirt in those pants. And when that bullet goes through, it's taking all that with it. So we've got to try and get those pieces of pants out of there. We got to clean some of the dirt out as best we can. But when it comes out, it's going to look like this. It's going to shatter that bone, especially with that type of bullet. This is why we had to do the amputations. We knew this would save his life. Now over here, Ed, this is Ed, this is my man Ed. Eye surgery was done during the war. Most of the time, if they had time to do it. A lot of it was done in your larger hospitals, but a lot of times it had to be done out on the field because the guy had to have his eye out. If you don't remove this eye, it affects the other eye, just like everything around here is all connected. Your eyes, your nose, your throat, all that is connected. So it's going to get infected. So it takes about 10 minutes to remove the eye. You don't mind if I do a little surgery here? Will that bother anybody? Okay. We have a retractor already applied to keep the eyelids back. In your eye, you have 6 muscles that control your eye. And that allows you to go around like this. Thank you. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to look and see if I can find those muscles. And I've located them. Then I'm going to take some, this is opium, and it comes in a powder form. What I'm going to do, I don't want to give him the good anesthesia that I'm using for surgeries, so I'm going to scratch around his eye and get it to bleed. And once it's bleeding, then I'm going to take this powder, it's opium powder, I'm going to place it in those spots that are bleeding, and that'll deaden the pain around his eye. Takes a couple minutes for the pain to go into effect. Now I'm going to take the scalpel and I'm going to go around, I'm going to cut all of those muscles all the way around.
And he's awake for this, right?
Pardon?
And he's awake for this?
Yes. The opium's going to take the pain away from his eye, so that's going to affect it there. He will be awake. He just won't feel any pain around his eye. Okay, now I've cut around the muscles. The other thing on the back of the eye is your optic nerve, and along that optic nerve is a tiny, tiny blood vessel that feeds blood to your eye. That goes from the back of your eye down to your skull in the back. So what I'm going to do is I need to pull out the eye and get to that optic nerve. And the optic nerve is right here. I'm going to clamp that. Like that. I'm going to take and cut the optic nerve. Once we cut that optic nerve, that is so small that it'll seal off itself because there isn't much of a blood vessel there. It'll seal itself after a while. It'll actually die off back to the skull. Now the other thing I need to do is I need to remove those muscles. Here's one. Hard to get a hold of. What have we got here? You're probably one of them that caused the damage to his eye, correct? Anybody? Get a hold of it. Here we go. Piece of stone.
Raglan, maybe?
Piece of stone. Now, there was slivers that come off tree bark and
Yeah,
or
shrapnel,
any
maybe like
shrapnel, any kinds of things would have damaged her eye. Then what we're gonna do is we're gonna take some moist lint, and lint came from the ladies back home. It's basically what comes out of your dryer. But back then, it would have taken a sharp knife on some cotton and gone like this to create lint. And they shipped boxes and boxes of this to us so we could use it for packing and wrapping and so forth. So basically, we're gonna clean this area out. I'm gonna take some bromine. I'm gonna pour it in that area, and that's gonna foam and help clean it. I'm gonna take some more lint, run it out in that area. And we're gonna remove this retractor. We're gonna pack it. And gonna send them back to the hospital tent to store it again. We'll be keeping an eye on them for about a week or two. That'll actually be what they call a dry socket. Now, infantry soldiers didn't have a whole lot of money, so more than likely they're gonna purchase an eye patch, which is very inexpensive, and that's what they're gonna wear. Officers had more money, more than likely they're gonna get a glass eye put in. Again, that took about 10 minutes to do, very, very quick. Over here we have different types of medications. We talk about bromine, we talked about that earlier. This is laudanum, and these are the actual colors of what they look like. I know I talked about this earlier with some people, and I didn't know what it was. Anybody have an idea what this is?
Is that for birds?
No. It's called a urinary catheter. This is 1860s. Men would get scar tissue and couldn't go to the bathroom, so that scar tissue had to be opened up in order for them to go. So this would be inserted. There's a wire that goes through here and a hole in the end. You're going to insert it, tie it around the waist, and then the doctor every once in a while will come around and open that up with the wire until he continually can go to the bathroom. When he does go to the bathroom, you're going to remove this wire and he'll be going through here. And then it'll be removed. Now this one here, same type of thing, urinary catheter, only this is probably 1870s, 1880s. A little bit more. This has a razor blade on it. It gets forced back and forth.
Was that not also the way that they treated, what do you call it, diseases like syphilis?
Yes, syphilis and gonorrhea, yes.
That was-
They did have medications for that, but that would also cause scar tissue.
Right.
And they would use these, exactly, yeah. Anesthesia, what kind of anesthesia did you think we had back then? Did we have chloroform and ether? Yes, we did.
Yeah, we must have.
In the Federal Army, we had that readily available to us. Chloroform we liked using a little better than the ether. Ether is volatile. So if you're in a house or a barn somewhere and you have lights at night, it's not a good thing to be using, unless you have a lot of air. Ether we could use outside. If we were outside in a tent or something in an airy area, we could use it there. The other thing with ether, if anybody's ever had any surgery and you wake up from ether, you don't feel good. You want to throw up. You just feel sick. But the chloroform we liked using better. If you ran low on either one, you could mix it 60-40 and it would still be effective. The way it's done, this is called an ether cone. You're going to place this over the victim's head, over his face, and this is called a dropper. You're going to place ether or chloroform in here, and you're going to drop it into the area here. Within 6 to 8 minutes, they're going to be what they call under. Now, chloroform, they would have gone into what they call a stupor. He was pretty much awake, he just didn't know what was going on. He might move, he might sit up, but that was the effects of the medication. That wasn't because of the surgery. Again, while they're doing the preparation work, in the area would have been a tourniquet would have been applied to the area, especially on the arm or in the leg area.
Don't even use today.
Any idea what this is?
Stethoscope.
Yes, exactly. This is a special stethoscope. The reason being, I was in Mechanicsville, New York one time doing a presentation, and a gentleman walked up to me and he says, do you know what this is? I go, certainly, it's a stethoscope. And I said, a very nice one. He goes, here, it's yours. I go, why are you giving it to me? He says, well, I'm a lathe turner by trade, and he says, I've seen you before, and he says, you do a good job. And he says, I went online, I looked up the exact dimensions, and he says, I made this for you. So I'm very proud of this. I take it with me when I do my demonstrations, but when I'm home, it goes in my cabinet. So I have a mixture of reproduction equipment and real equipment down here. This is another bone saw. And again, the wooden handle. This is where a lot of the infection came from. If they weren't infected before they got to me, I obviously helped, unbeknownst to me. This is an original amputation knife. Very big, very long. This would have been used in the thigh area because of the length. And it's been used many times. If you look at later on, you come up and look at these. Right in here, it's raised up where the blade used to be. It's been sharpened many, many times. This is called a director. When you're doing surgery in a tight spot and there's one thing or two things that you don't want to affect while you're using your scalpel, you slide your scalpel down here and this will specify in a certain area where you're going to cut or whatever. You can use it that way, or you can put a scalpel in here like this and use it too. It just makes it easier to use, more definite. And they came in different sizes. This is an original bone pick. It's made out of brass. In an area where the bone's been shattered, you want to try and get all the bone pieces. So this piece you pick with, and then there's a little scoop here on the end, and you can use the scoop to scoop out. Any idea what this saw is for? Called a metacarpal metatarsal saw. This is for fingers and toes. Same type of thing. It's a little bullet scoop. We're scooping bullets. This is a postmortem kit. This is an original postmortem kit. If you had the time, once a person passed away, you could use this to try and diagnose what happened to them. And there's several scalpels in here. Another director. This is what they call an assistant surgeon's kit or a pocket kit. This is an amputation kit. You have a handle that's removable, and you have a bone saw, and you have a knife that would attach to it, along with different scalpels. This is a bone file, and a couple forceps on there. This is still used today, especially by veterinarians. Looks like this, very sharp on the end. Any guesses what it's for? Something like this would have been used in the chest area. Wooden handle.
Is it to open up a lung?
You're close. It's for removing fluids.
Oh, okay.
It's called a trocar. Today in the medical field, there's a needle with a tube. So they're gonna puncture the needle in, and then the fluids will run down the tube. Same idea. You're gonna puncture this into the chest area here. Then you take a pull on this, and it creates a vacuum. And then you're just gonna leave it in the area, and it'll drain. And you might have to go in and do it, puncture it again, because it would close up until it's thoroughly drained. Veterinarians still use these today on animals. I don't think they look like this. But this is the chloroform they would have used. Iodine. Any idea what this is?
Take out a tooth.
Yes, this is called a longeur. It's used for removing tooth pullers. You would have soldiers come in for sick call at 7 o'clock in the morning. They also call it surgeon's call. And they come in with a toothache, and you give them rub a little bit of whiskey on his tooth, and you pull it out. You wouldn't use anesthesia or anything else. They were just happy to get the tooth out. This kit right here is called a trepanning kit. Soldiers would have pressure on the brain, and we would use a procedure for drilling a hole in the brain through the skull, just down to the dura mater. You couldn't go any further than that. If that, you would kill them, because it would go into the brain. But you had a little pin right here that you would adjust for the distance to go through the brain, through the skull, cranium, and you actually drill a hole, turn it like this, remove it, and then if you had pieces of bone, cranium that you need to remove in certain spots, this is called a Hayes saw. This is original. And you have the curved spot here and a flat spot that you could cut on the cranium. This is called a lifter. This is used for lifting pieces of bone out or looking underneath a piece of bone. And those are original. Over here I have some pictures of amputations. I'll give you an idea what some of these men went through. You can pass that around. During the war, there were a bunch of field hospitals. This will give you an idea what a field hospital looked like at Savage Station, Virginia in 1862. Those are all wounded soldiers, and they're about to be captured by the Confederate Army because they were being surrounded. There's a surgeon right in the front looking at the wounded, doing triage on them. Now, does anybody have any questions about anything? Geez, I covered everything? Yes.
Shock.
Shock. They really didn't know much about shock. They just looked at it, knew what the guy was going through, and they called it shock. They really didn't know what it was, and they just gave him some medication for it. They thought it was going to work. Like I said, a lot of these medications they were giving these guys just didn't work.
Were there any guys that were really ahead of their time and figured out like transfusions and stuff like that, but it just didn't catch them? Are you aware of it? Because it would there's a certain amount of common sense almost there.
But with a transfusion, again, you have to use the same blood type. They didn't know about blood types. Think about that.
Yeah.
There were 2 transfusions done in 1865. Paris surgeon discovered how to do it, and he wrote a dissertation on it. A couple American doctors saw this towards the end of the war, and they said, we're going to try this. So they did it to 2 men, and they saved their lives. They were about ready to pass away. That's how weak they were. They sopped up some of their blood. Luckily, they used their own blood and injected it back into them, and it saved their lives. But that was the only 2 transfusions that I know of really done, and it was late 1865. So That was, yes.
With infections, I'd heard that one of the armies ran out of sutures and they were boiling horsehair and then they just, yeah, now is that true?
That's a fact. The Confederate Army would have done this because of the Anaconda Plan blockade that went all across the coast, so they couldn't get their supplies in and out like they wanted to. So they said, well, I wonder if we can use horsehair. But they couldn't use it the way it came off the horse. They had to do something to it to make it pliable.
Urine.
No.
Oh, okay.
Nice thought, though. It's clean.
We boiled that, right?
Yes, they boiled it. What they realized was these men were not getting infections as much and surviving. And they didn't know why. They just knew as long as they kept boiling this to make it pliable that it was a good thing. I mean, Lister didn't come out with the germ theory until 1872, I think. So, you know, I don't know how long it took them to figure it out, but it was well after the war.
So they didn't conquer the infection.
No,
Uh,
no, they didn't. No. Infections continued throughout the war till the end. And then the probably 1870s, 1880s, they started coming out with instruments that didn't have wooden handles and better coating on it. They used nickel during the war, which wasn't the best stuff to use. And then they started using better metals and boiling. So,
But there were some things that the sanitary commissions advised and they did.
yes, during the war, the Sanitary Commission would come in 1862, and they would tell the men in the camps that you need to wash your hands more, you need to wash your faces more, take baths if possible, which they were supposed to be doing already. The Army told them to do that, but the other side of it was the Army would never give them time to do it. They're always marching, going into battle here and there, so they just gave up and said, well, we're not going to bother doing it anymore. So with the Sanitary Commission coming into the camps, it was kind of tough, but they finally broke them of it, started washing a little bit better. The sinks were located behind the tents. That's what they called the latrine back then. It was a sink. It was 8 feet long, 6 feet deep, 2 feet wide trench. And they put it right behind the tents because they had the diarrhea and dysentery. It wasn't far for them to go. But where are the flies going to land?
Right there.
Where are they going to eat their dinners? Out in front of their tent. Flies are going to land on there. Now you've got a vicious circle, round and around, and I'm the one that saw it every morning because they were coming in, Doc, I can't stop going, da, 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 da. Well, we'll give you some medications and try and take care of it. But you know as well as I do with diarrhea, if you go too far and you get too dehydrated, you're not coming back. And that's what happened with a lot of these guys. Dysentery is basically the bloody side of diarrhea. Once you start bleeding blood, that's a tough thing to stop.
What about opiate addiction? You're using opium on your wounds, you're using it as a painkiller.
This happened, but it wasn't as prevalent as a lot of people would think.
Okay.
There were some men that were, because of overtime, you're not giving them a whole lot of opium, but it was just over time that they became.
Then I would wonder, because that's what we have around. And if you have some push comes to shove, it's there, or you're going to try to get it out.
Exactly. Well, some of these guys would try and steal. And the Confederate Army, especially if they overran a camp, this is one of the places they're going to take because they want the medications. Because it's stuff they don't have. So they're going to try and take it. And they might take me if I'm there. They might put me in jail. It's all up to them what they want to do with me. I mean, I'm there as a surgeon. I would operate if they wanted me to, just so I didn't go to jail.
Well, but you also have the Hippocratic Oath.
Exactly.
So.
Exactly. Yeah. Now at the Battle of Antietam, it was 1 day battle, and it was, like I was saying before, over 22,000 wounded and died. So you've got all these men there. The Confederates took off, left their wounded. They didn't even take them with them. So they left their surgeons there. The surgeons volunteered, and everybody was working on everybody else's units. I mean, Confederates were working on Union soldiers were working on Confederates. It was just a mess. But they saved lives. And it was like you mentioned, the Hippocratic Oath. That's what they were trained to do. My schooling was 2 years in college at Genesee Medical College in upstate New York. And first year was books and lab, and what do you think I did the second year?
Surgery.
Cadavers.
No, cadavers were frowned upon during the Civil War in New York State. Yes.
What did you do?
Was it a prize?
No, I took the same classes over again to make sure I got them right. Absolutely. Yep. Yep. Now the war comes along, the Army comes up to me, say, we've got all these wounded men, we need some surgeons out on the field. I know you're not fully trained, but we'll pay you. I go, great. But I never had any actual hands-on. We'll show you out on the field.
Right.
And this happened. Some great surgeons came out of this. Some guys were not as good, but that's the way it happened. And that's how they got so many of these 12,000 surgeons out on the field, is going to the medical schools. They had no other place to go. The 110 surgeons they had at the beginning of the war, like I said, 29 went to the Confederacy. The rest of them, they were old. The last war they were involved in was the Mexican War in 1846. I mean, you're talking these guys are 70 years old. They're not going to go out on a battlefield and do surgery. So this is why they went to these colleges and got these young men.
Were they still doing like bloodletting and leeches?
At the beginning of the war, they were doing that, but it phased out very quickly. It was just, at the beginning of the war, a lot of homeopathic type medications and stuff, and it wasn't working. Again, this is why they came out with the pannier, because of that.
I think doctors still used fingers as probes up until the time of William McKinley, because I think McKinley dies from infection.
Yes,
because,
infection because they went in, yeah,
Right.
with the bullet wound.
and
Yeah.
That's 1900.
Yes, yeah. It's amazing. A lot of times I'll go different places and I'll hear different things, and like you people talking to me, this is where I really discover some things. At the 150th Gettysburg, I was there doing my demonstrations. That was an awesome thing. I mean, I was getting 30, 40 people out in front of me, and they'd move, and another 20 or 30 would come along. It was just, my wife had to stop me for lunch because I was just going. I really loved that. But I had the bone saw, and one group moved off, and an older woman came up to me, and she goes, I just retired from the surgical theater. She says, I was in there for 44 years. I says, congratulations, you know. She says, do you know they still use those bone saws like that? I go, you're kidding me. I said, for what? I says, don't you have those nice buzz saws?
Right.
She goes, what happens is on the femur, they get about halfway through and it jams. If they start up to cut it again, it has a tendency of fracturing the bone. So we have one of these off to the side, and we finish the cut. It's a lot smoother, and it won't fracture the bone. I flipped out. I'm going, oh my God. I said, I wouldn't learn that in a book, and I wouldn't learn that on TV, but somebody like you coming up to me and telling me that, it's fantastic. So this is another reason why I enjoy doing this, because of things that I hear from you people. So it's something I love to do. And this is another side of the war a lot of people don't know about. They don't realize, they don't see it. But it happened, you know. The surgeons had to deal with this stuff, sometimes 3 or 4 days in a row without sleep. It depended on the battle.
Why did you get interested in this? You're not a physician.
I'm not a physician. I got a lot of books at home. I got almost 300 books on the Civil War. 40 or 50 of them are probably medical stuff. And I met a gentleman at the 145th Gettysburg that was doing demonstrations, and I thought he was awesome. His name's Bob Urban. He's from Maryland, and he's my mentor. I've known Bob for over 15 years. In fact, I just hung out with Bob at an event down in Pennsylvania last weekend. So he gives me little things once in a while when I see him, so I don't complain about it. I was telling him about a suturing needle that I bought at Gettysburg. Well, how much did you pay for it? I said $40. He goes, wow, that was expensive. He says, wait a minute. He goes in, he comes out, and he's got this little thing, and he opens up, and it's got about 10 different needles in it. And he says, I don't have a flat. He says, you have a flat needle, straight needle? I go, no. He says, here. So he gives it to me. So we've been good friends, and he's really mentored me and helps me to do my demonstrations. And he corrects me when I do something wrong, which he should. Any more questions about anything?
What about the lighting during your surgeries?
The lighting would have been candlelight or lanterns at night. That's what we had to use, a lot of them. And this was part of the problem with the ether. If we used ether, we couldn't use it. And I like to smoke my cigar while I'm doing surgeries. That didn't work out too good. Any more questions, folks?
That's interesting.
Thank you for coming today. I really appreciate it. If you'd like, you can come down here and look at some of the instruments. If you have any more questions, I can talk some more about it. And, feel free.
Thank you very much, sir.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And the Yankee hard by with a wheel of a rifle just ready to pop his private wire. Now is not the time of the complaining, I'm spoiling to meet you, Abel Lincoln Esquire. You blacker, it's only I'm weary of the rain, and I'm the rain.